Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first Speech Spotlight of 2022. My name is Michelle Deutschman, and I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. If you're new to the center, welcome. The center is dedicated to exploring the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning, and considering what can be done to restore trust in the value of free speech on college campuses and within society at large. Before we dive into today's topic and introduce our three esteemed experts, I want to share a few center opportunities with you. As many of you know, the center has a National Fellows Program that selects people from a broad range of backgrounds, such as law, journalism, higher education, social science, technology, and government. And fellows receive funding to spend a year furthering the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. We're accepting applications for next year's class of fellows until March 3rd, and I believe that the link to the application will be dropped into today's question and answer chat. Additionally, registration for our annual Speech Matters conference, our theme this year, Safeguarding Democracy, is open. We have a stellar lineup of speakers and panels, so I would encourage you to sign up today. Finally, please note that attendees have the ability to turn on captions by clicking live transcript in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window and then selecting show subtitle. And of course, you can add questions by using the Q&A function. Now to today's subject, student activism against sexual violence on campus. This is a topic I have long wanted to highlight as part of our Speech Spotlight series. Yesterday, the center published an installment of Ask the Experts that asked our panelists to describe how student voices can be most impactful in effectuating meaningful change related to sexual assault on campus at a personal, university, and/or federal level. You can scan the QR code on the slide to visit the page directly. This afternoon, we have the opportunity to continue learning from our experts on this important, albeit challenging topic. Let me take a minute to tell you a little bit about each of them. Tommy Jung is a returning undergraduate representative to the UC Title IX Student Advisory Board. He's been involved in various student-led Title IX initiatives since 2019. Jung worked as a Title IX coordinator at Associated Students of UC San Diego, where he collaborated with the undergraduate student body president to break down Title IX investigative policies for students. He's also partnered with UC San Diego's CARE at SARC to improve student access to online resources. Tom is a recent grad of UCSD and holds a BS in political science data analytics. Danésha Nichols is the Director of Harassment and Discrimination Assistance and Prevention Program, HDAP, at UC Davis. She's been with UC Davis since September 2004 and has held a variety of roles across the Davis and Sacramento campuses, including labor relations consultant, investigations coordinator, and labor relations supervisor. Prior to joining UC Davis, Danésha practiced employment law in a small boutique firm in Sacramento before she realized she did not like lawyering. She counts herself as a recovering lawyer. There's a couple lawyers on today's webinar. I think there's three of us. Suzanne Taylor is the Systemwide Title IX Director for the University of California. Prior to coming to UC, she was a civil rights attorney for over a decade with the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, where she investigated complex civil rights allegations, including institution-wide sexual violence complaints. As Systemwide Title IX Director, Suzanne provides direction and support for Title IX offices on UC campuses. Among other roles, her office assists in implementing system-wide initiatives and best practices in prevention, detection, and response. So before we dive in, I'm going to start by asking Suzanne to set the table for us and highlight kind of the role of student voices in the last couple of decades and how that's intersected with all of the recent action on Title IX regulations. It's been a little bit like watching a tennis match: regulation, change, regulation, change. So Suzanne, why don't you kick it off?
Thanks so much, Michelle. I am really thrilled to be here with you and Danésha and Tommy today. Really appreciate the invitation. And I am very happy to share a little bit of background because I think it demonstrates just how powerful student voices can be and in fact have been in this area. So there was a grassroots student-led movement that started over a decade ago, and it was intended to shine a light on the problem of sexual violence on college campuses. And that movement led to really profound changes nationwide. And so what we saw from students, and this is on campuses across the country, was them really amplifying this issue in a variety of ways. They were sharing their personal stories, which was really powerful. They were organizing campus protests, awareness campaigns, petition drives. They were engaging with their campus administrators and also meeting with state and federal officials. And they were also filing complaints against their schools with the Office for Civil Rights, which is the agency in the U.S. Department of Education that enforces Title IX, and as you said, where I was actually working at the time. And students also sued their schools. They filed private lawsuits alleging Title IX violations. And these actions really garnered a lot of media attention. Really everyone was paying attention. And so in terms of some of the changes that we saw at the federal level, well, a lot happened at the federal level, but I think probably one of the most important things is that the Office for Civil Rights issued important guidance explaining how schools should respond to allegations of sexual violence. They also really ramped up their Title IX enforcement, and that was through really an unprecedented number of Title IX investigations of campuses that were pretty sweeping in scope. For their part, universities responded through actions like revising their sexual harassment policies and procedures, really developing prevention education, creating advocacy services, putting much needed resources into investigative offices, and elevating the authority and the profile of their Title IX officers. And we saw evolution at the student level too. Most importantly, I think students really developed a better understanding of consent and what constitutes misconduct. They became empowered to seek redress or not to do so, which is also really important. They learned to access campus resources to ensure that they could continue to have access to their education. And I think they also made some really significant inroads towards destigmatizing the experience of sexual violence. And I think it's a really important thing because aside from changing laws and changing policies, this is really about changing the culture that allows sexual violence to occur. Of course, we see students continuing to raise their powerful voices today. And likewise, we all are continuing to build on the tremendous progress that this earlier movement sparked.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. That was a great kind of way to condense a lot of what has happened. And I want to hone in a little more on sort of the recent past and this continuation of student activism against sexual violence and the different forms that it's taken. And I would just love to hear from all of our panelists, maybe Danésha can start with, where does student activism sort of fit in, and what power do student voices hold, especially in this moment?
Sure. Again, just thanking everybody for inviting me, and I'm so excited to be here with my esteemed panelists and excited to share with you all. That's a great question. And so from our perspective, student voices are so important in terms of really advancing and evolving a culture and a climate on campus and really helping the institution kind of narrow in on the student experience, on what their needs are, on what support would be helpful from the student perspective. And so that voice, that connection to the student body is just really so important for us and for administrators who do this work. And so for our purposes, the students are really such an important part of our process in speaking out when they see issues or concerns, and standing up when they see someone being impacted, and supporting individuals who are coming forward. We understand and expect that the first reactions that a survivor has from other folks around them really is impactful in terms of their ability to access services and to really begin the process of moving forward and healing. And so student voices are really just so powerful from that perspective. And then I know for our campus and for other campuses, we really appreciate connecting directly with students as administrators and hearing from them, for them sharing their perspectives, so that we can figure out ways to address, like I said, concerns or needs or support or resources, or ways to help folks understand what's available on their individual and respective campuses. And we're hoping that students use those voices to take that information back and empower students to really kind of speak up and speak their truth and know the different kinds of resources and support available to them. And so they're just a vital part of our work and a part of this community and a part of our community.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So Tommy, as a recent grad, I'd love to hear your thoughts on student voices and how you see those voices in activism kind of working right now against sexual assault on campus.
Yeah, and I think Suzanne did a great job on highlighting some of the cultural changes as well as the policy changes that students have been pushing for, not just in the recent years, but a decade ago as well. One thing I want to highlight is the importance of student voices when identifying gaps that are difficult to identify from the policy level, because oftentimes I think there's an emphasis on, much of the recent discussion on Title IX and sexual violence on college campuses has been around the investigative process or the policy itself, but there's so many gaps that exist between students in getting to that investigative policy, or students who are navigating that investigative policy might also have some questions or myths about the process that might prevent them from getting the best resources that they need to support them through the process, that process itself. One thing I've also seen a lot at the campus level is advocating for more resources dedicated to supporting survivors, making sure that our investigators and the investigative process is trauma informed as well. So I really think there's this big role that students play in not only bringing attention to those issues, but also providing their input on how these issues need to be addressed. Because identifying the issue is the first part. We also need to come up with solutions that are both community informed and accessible. So that's what I would say.
No, that's great. Thank you. As someone who's sort of a policy wonk, whenever I do my workshops on the First Amendment, I always talk about how policies are only good if people know what they are and they actually know how to use them, right? So if you don't know what tools you have and you don't know how to utilize those tools, then the policy can be meaningless. And so I think that's really important. And I know we're going to get in a few minutes into some of the details of the complaint process. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about coalition building, because effective activism means forming coalitions, and that can be between students. I think that can be between staff and students. And I'd love to ask each of you to explain a little bit about how that works. And Danésha, why don't you start and talk about how you do that in your role, how your office does that, maybe give us a little window into how things work on a campus.
Sure. So on our campus, coalition building is really a cornerstone of how we approach sexual harassment, sexual violence response. And we go about it in a variety of ways. We really try to connect with our different student leaders on campus. So our associated student body, the government, we try to connect with those individuals because they have such a connection to the broader student body, to really speak to, again, what are their needs, what are their needs, what are gaps in terms of what we provide and what they're looking for, what parts of our process are confusing or intimidating, and really try to brainstorm ways that we're going to approach those different kinds of topics. And so we connect with our different student groups on campus, our Greek life folks on campus, just with this goal in mind of continuing to build relationships with folks who have the ear of the students, to make sure that we're connected with one another, and really understanding each other's role in terms of advocating and supporting a campus environment that's free from harassment and sexual violence. It's ongoing, it's meaningful. It's not one of those types of things where it's like we have one interaction and then we're done. I mean, it's really this kind of consistent decision and work to build a relationship where there's trust and mutual respect, and folks can feel free to speak their perspective and their minds, knowing that each side will kind of take that in and really try to think through, how are we going to work together for the benefit of our community and for the benefit of our students.
Great, thank you. And we'll put a pin in your mention of Greek life, because we got a couple questions from participants when they registered. But Tommy, will you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the advisory board that you're part of and sort of your experiences in being in coalition, especially with administrators?
Yeah, of course. So I can talk a little bit about the Student Advisory Board. It was the UC System-Wide Student Advisory Board, the UC System-Wide Title IX Student Advisory Board was formed in 2018, and the goal was to give students a greater role in the system-wide Title IX process. And it's composed of both graduate and undergraduate students from different UC campuses. And I'm currently the undergraduate representative that's from UC San Diego. I think I can talk a little bit about what the Student Advisory Board is, but I think the best way to illustrate its purpose is to talk about some of the things that we've done. We've provided comments and suggestions on sexual violence and sexual harassment policy revisions, most recently with integrating with Senate Bill 493 and the previous Title IX revisions that were made a couple of years ago. We've reviewed staff trainings and provided suggestions as well as additions for the UC Responsible Employee Refresher Training. Members of the SAB have been part of hiring panels for both campus level and system-wide directors or assistant directors for survivor support offices and Title IX offices. And we've had opportunities to provide a comment during public review periods for federal level guidance as well. And I think something that really stood out to me is this idea that coalition building is ongoing, that it's not a transactional process, but it's relationship building. And that's one thing that I really do appreciate about the Student Advisory Board is that there's open communication between not only the system-wide directors and us, but also between the students as well, because it's important to be engaged and aware of the great work that other students are doing on other campuses so that there can be coalition building towards causes that we all share. And I'll talk a little bit more about the grander idea of coalition building later, but that's what I would say.
Okay, great. Suzanne, anything you want to jump in and add?
Just to underscore that the Student Advisory Board really has provided invaluable advice to my office as we've been formulating policy, as Tommy said, and engaging in other work. And yeah, I mean, I'm just so glad that we put it in place. And I'll just add one other detail, which is that each of the members of the board are also expected to form connections with the Title IX offices on their campuses, as well as the CARE offices. And UC CARE is the Centers for Advocacy, Resources, and Education. And so they're forming connections at both the system-wide level and also at the campus level, which I think is really important. And then the campuses also have some, as Danésha was saying, really innovative ways of gathering input from students at sort of critical times in policy development, for example, having listening sessions, town halls, and that sort of thing. And so that's just another really important way to make sure that students have an official voice in the process.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the process. Let's get into the weeds a little bit and talk a little bit about this issue of sort of kind of demystifying the complaint process, and what parts in particular do you think are either unclear or may create obstacles for students wanting to report. And, you know, Suzanne, do you want to start? Or any of you can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from Tommy, but from this, you know, to get that student perspective. But I will just, you know, I'll sort of say at the outset and maybe just acknowledge that, you know, there are a lot of different legal requirements that universities have to comply with in terms of their Title IX process. It makes our procedures very complex and dense, and they are just candidly hard to understand. And you know, sort of complicating that is we have the federal Title IX regulations, which we'll probably talk about at some point. We don't like the process that the Title IX regulations requires. And so at UC, what we've done is we've created two processes. We follow the Title IX regulatory process where it's required, and we use the process we had in place before the regulations were issued for all other complaints. And we think that's the best approach. It's the most protective of our community, but it is just candidly more confusing. And so we're waiting for new Title IX regulations, and I think that's going to make things better, but it's not going to resolve the complexity because this is just a complex process. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that even before Tommy starts explaining specifically what's really confusing about it.
Well, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think that's part of why we're having this discussion, which is to be authentic and transparent about what's good and what's hard. And Tommy, then let's turn to you next to share kind of from the student perspective, and then we'll let Danésha jump in.
Yeah, great. I think I can share a few specific examples. I think there's a lot of questions about the complaint process itself, but I want to highlight a couple of questions in between where a student is making a decision to report or not, or to receive help from the university or resources from the university. Specifically when it comes to confidentiality, who is a confidential resource, who is not a confidential resource. Or I think it's difficult because there are legal definitions of words that we use colloquially. So confidentiality doesn't necessarily mean the same thing during the Title IX or the SVSH process at UC than what students might have in mind. And I think a specific example I can point to is we've interviewed a student when we were collaborating with Carrot Sark who confided in their professor about an incident that happened during the class. And the professor did disclose to the student that they were a responsible employee, but didn't necessarily expand upon what that meant. And they contacted the Title IX office, or at UC San Diego, that's the Office for the Prevention of Harassment and Discrimination, and they made a report. So the student was contacted by OPHD and felt like there was a breach of trust because they believed that the professor would be a confidential resource. And while they were a private resource, they were still a responsible employee, which meant that they did need to file that report. And unfortunately, this experience discouraged the students from seeking resources, not just reporting or seeking an investigation, but receiving resources full stop from at UC San Diego. So I think that's one example that kind of highlights how it's important to clarify a lot of definitions that are used in the legal language. Another thing that I've also seen a lot of is questions surrounding accommodations, whether there needs to be an investigation or report for there to be certain accommodations to be made. And I think if I were to talk more about specific examples, then we can be here for hours, but I will point out that a lot of these questions and myths are often localized and they differ from campus to campus. One great example I can point to is how at UC San Diego, we don't have a traditional fraternity row that other college campuses do. And there's a lot of questions about, what about incidents that occur in fraternity environments or fraternity or sorority environments, but aren't necessarily part of campus or part of fraternity row? Are those reportable? And these questions are specific to UC San Diego because other college campuses do have those spaces. So I think one thing I'll kind of end off with is to properly identify these knowledge gaps. There needs to be more communication between students and administrators at the campus level. And communication is kind of a two-way street where there needs to be more information going to students from administrators about these processes, but there also needs to be more student input going to administrators, because that's the only way that we can truly get a holistic view of how students are interacting with the policy. I don't think there really is a catch-all list of questions and myths that students have, even at the UC system or, God forbid, the national system, just because these questions are reactive of the environments that we have, and each environment is different.
Yeah, it sounds like a law school exam. It's very fact specific, which I'm sure makes it complicated. If you don't mind a quick follow-up, Tommy, you talked about some accommodations that might need to be made. Would you mind just explaining a little bit, some examples of what those are for people that may not be familiar with what accommodations in this sort of arena would entail?
Yeah, and I think the range of accommodations vary. I think the very basic is, making sure that students are provided with counseling support, so through our CAPS or specifically our care advisors. And there's also some scheduling changes that need to be made specifically for students or complainants who might be in classes where they are with a respondent, or where survivors might not want, survivors might want to avoid opportunities and running into more respondents. And I think that oftentimes, or in other cases as well, these resources can be financial as well. When students are reporting an incident of domestic violence, they might need spaces to stay, they might need transitional housing. So it's kind of a wide umbrella, but I think a lot of students aren't aware that these resources can be available to them if they aren't engaging with the campus resources that are available to them. So I think it's really a case-to-case basis, but it is a very wide umbrella.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, and I know it's helpful for me to know some of those specific examples. Okay, Danésha, let us know what you want to add.
I mean, I just want to echo, I think, what Suzanne said, that our processes are candidly complex and challenging. and then they change depending upon changes in law and changes in thinking. And so it can be a daunting process to navigate. I think one concern that I think comes up frequently, at least on our campus, is students don't always know what constitutes the behavior that's prohibited and what doesn't. It's confusing for them. And there's sometimes a worry about being wrong or getting it wrong. And do I share this, not knowing whether or not this is truly going to arise to a level that really falls under policy. And so to try to really demystify that for folks, at least on our campus, our office tries to provide as much information as we can to students, not only when they are incoming students, but also ongoing as concerns come up. We try to be available so that if students want to ask questions anonymously before they start to report their concerns specifically to our office, so they can get a better sense of process and what we're looking for and the types of information that we're looking for. But we also want to encourage students that reporting, even if at the end of the day, let's say we're not going to find, a policy violation, that doesn't mean that there's not a wealth of support available to individuals and things that can be done to provide for them and really help them to move forward and continue to engage meaningfully in their education or those types of things. And so trying to get that word out and connect with our students on that has been really work that we've put a lot of thought and effort into to try to demystify that process and have folks and students not worry so much about where the outcome is, but just connecting, let us help you, walk you through the process, because we understand it is confusing and it can be a little intimidating.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can relate to it from the speech sense, in that just because something is protected speech doesn't mean there aren't a wealth of resources to respond to it or to give students who feel targeted the support that they need, even though the outcome may be that it's legal speech. And sort of diving a little bit more kind of into the law and sort of speech related, there's been a lot of discussion of sort of potential reputational harm that can come from these complaints, especially anonymous complaints. And I'm wondering, and here I'll start with you, Danésha, how do you handle this, in your office, and will the outcome be different if the complainant is identifiable versus not identifiable?
We receive a lot of anonymous complaints in our office. In fact, we try to make it as easy as possible for folks to report, and for folks to report as much or as little information as they want, including whether or not to share their identities. And so we're always balancing, the desire for folks to be able to report anonymously with some of the due process concerns that may trigger, because obviously if we're talking about potentially, taking formal action or a formal review process, we need to be able to have the respondents have to have the opportunity to know who the complainants are and to really confront the witnesses against them. And so trying to balance out those needs is challenging. That said, we still value anonymous complaints quite a bit. One, just from the standpoint of helping us understand what's happening climate-wise, where might we need to focus our education or kind of proactive prevention measures. So that's super helpful to us from that standpoint alone. And then also with our anonymous complaints, I mean, depending upon the level of detail that we're provided, there are often opportunities for informal types of resolutions, education, particularly target education with respondents. Our campus maintains a database of all cases that we receive, including anonymous complaints, and we are maintaining respondent names as well. So we're looking for things like repeated behavior, patterns of behavior, locations where certain things might be coming up, or is there circumstance going on in a particular department or in a particular organization. I think we've had talked a little bit about kind of our Greek organization. Sometimes we'll get information that is suggesting, is there something going on in that organization that we need to look in a little more closely? And so we're balancing out those needs. We're balancing out that need for due process, but also the need to really address circumstances and situations that are arising for folks in the institution. And I have an example of a really creative, I think, approach that our campus had taken to anonymous complaints. It did involve Greek organizations. We had received information suggesting possible sexual violence and sexual harassment kind of being rampant in a particular organization. We had received multiple complaints, some on social media. And so what we were trying to do, because we knew, again, that we might not be able to take, administrative action or disciplinary action down the road with individuals because of the kind of the potential lack of due process, we engaged in what we call an other inquiry review, which is really focused on kind of gathering information from an institutional perspective. We really identified folks who would be connected with the organization itself, sent out surveys to get a sense from folks kind of what their experiences were, what's more word of mouth, rumor mill versus what people have experienced versus what people had observed, to really kind of get a sense of just really perspective. And then from there, really narrowed it down to specific individuals that would be hopefully willing to share what their experiences had been, so that we could get a sense then also, like, are there specific individualized concerns that we need to be dealing with. And then we used that information and evaluated that information, and really came out with, I think, a really good review of what was going on. We understood that there were certain individual complaints that had actually already been brought to our attention and addressed, and some of the information was kind of rumor mill. And so we printed out or presented an investigatory report, or a report, in another inquiry report for the public consumption, to understand what was our process, what did we learn from this process, and what steps were we going to put into place, both educationally with the organization, and then potentially within, obviously within limits with the individuals who had been identified. And so so that's one way that we deal with kind of those anonymous complaints, and try to find, again, that balance between addressing a concern and then also respecting due process.
Thank you. Just a couple follow-ups. I see some questions coming in about this particular issue. One of them is wanting to clarify that when the panelists are saying anonymous, does this mean a student can accuse a person, name that person, but not reveal their own name?
We receive complaints where a respondent is named and the complainant is not named. And again, we're going to evaluate that information because we have that information. What action flows from that is going to be dependent on a whole host of things: the level of detail of the concern, due process response and concern for the respondent. And so we may not be able to take a formal disciplinary action, and certainly, we're wanting to be fair to both parties, but maybe that's helpful for us in terms of, like I said, education or support from that perspective.
Okay, and one more specific question about Dave is that someone asked what platform you use to answer questions anonymously, and I don't know if that's something you can share now or get in touch later with people. I don't.
Oh, sure. I mean, we have just a variety of ways that anonymous complaints come to our attention. We've got online reports that come to us. It's not as easy to respond back to online reports because we don't have a contact information typically on online reports, so it's not necessarily a two-way conversation. We have our email address. We have an email address, and sometimes students or staff or faculty, for that matter, will have a generic email address, and so we can kind of go back and forth with communication and answer questions that way, and also speak to process and hopefully help folks become more comfortable with potentially maybe sharing more information and sharing their identities. And then we have an anonymous call line where folks can call in and then connect directly with individuals from our office to speak through process and resolution options.
Okay, thank you. I see also a couple questions coming in about something that kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of reputation and due process, which is this idea of defamation. And we had a couple participants send some questions in advance. So I don't know, Suzanne, if maybe you could spend a minute just talking about this idea of someone, filing a complaint, having their name be out there, and then the response is a threat of a defamation lawsuit, and sort of what colleges can do in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, I can't give an in-depth response, but I'll share sort of a high level, what I know about it. We have at UC seen some claims of defamation and also malicious prosecution. Often they go hand in hand, made against complainants. That can obviously have a chilling effect on both complainants and witnesses, and in particular could deter complainants from coming forward, which is already a difficult decision for many. So it's a real concern. My understanding is that we have generally had pretty good luck in getting these claims dismissed, or our complainants have had luck getting these claims dismissed before they get very far. And one of the questions that seems to be important is whether the alleged defamation is statements made by the complainant while they're merely engaging in the Title IX administrative process, or whether the complainant is also engaged in other forms of speech. So did they hold a press conference? Were they writing op-eds? Were they using social media? And in particular, that could be relevant if they're doing that before the investigation and the disciplinary process is complete. So in the former scenario, where the complainant has only engaged in the administrative process, the complainant seems far more likely to prevail in the lawsuit early. But when they've engaged in speech outside of that, it's a little more complicated, and the litigation is likely to have a longer life.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And Tommy, before we move on, I just didn't know if you wanted to jump in and add any thoughts you had sort of on this topic of anonymity and anonymous complaints before we move on to a different topic.
I don't have any comments at the top of my head right now, but if we loop back at the end, then I'll be sure to add them in there.
Okay, I'm going to just go to two other questions on the theme of kind of disclosure. One asking more specifically, responding, I think, Tommy, to the example you gave about the student sharing information, and sort of the question of what should the faculty member have done in that situation? Should the faculty stop the student and be transparent that they're required to report and then allow the student to continue? I think we're looking sort of for a best practices suggestion here, and I'll open it up to any of you.
So that is the advice that we typically give. This is included in the trainings that we provide for all of our employees, that it's important to make sure. So at UC, I saw one of the questions in the chat was around, having policies where all employees are not required to report to Title IX. At UC, we do require that all employees report to Title IX unless they're specifically designated as confidential. We actually see that as a really important way for the Title IX offices to receive information that aids us in our prevention and response efforts. And I think the key is making sure students know that that is true before they make a disclosure. And so I think, advising faculty members, for example, to tell students in advance, some even put it on their syllabi, they let students know that they are responsible employees, and if they disclose something in an assignment, for example, they would have to share that with the Title IX office. We do advise that they do that, because I think it's what we want is to empower students to make informed choices about where their information goes.
Okay, thank you. Danésha, did you want to add something?
Oh, just really kind of going along with what Suzanne said, for our campus, we've created specific insignias that go on your signature block that indicate your role as a responsible employee. We have scripts for faculty and staff to use to help them acclimate to the language of kind of letting folks know that they're responsible employees. We have blurbs that go into folks' syllabi and help with kind of language around the first day, and kind of really speaking through what their role as responsible employees, so that students are aware early on and empowered about their decisions in terms of who they're going to connect with and share their experiences.
And to the extent that any of the panelists have those things that we can share as resources with participants, so they can, work off of the good work that you're already doing, that would be great. I want to move for a minute into a little bit into the weeds of the Title IX regulations, just because it's the lawyer in me, because we know that, updated regulations are allegedly coming down the pipeline in April. And so I sort of wanted to ask each of you or the group your thoughts, because, under the Trump administration, there was a change so that the standard for hostile environment sexual harassment was severe, persistent, or persuasive, and that was changed to severe and persuasive. So we're talking about the change of a preposition, but I think that really matters. And one of the reasons that the Department of Education said they did this was to protect free speech rights and academic freedom rights of students and faculty. And as a center that focuses on these issues, I'm curious if you feel that the change was beneficial, and if you really think the change actually was able to assist in the goal that they were trying to pursue.
I have some thoughts I'd be happy to share.
Thank you.
So I think what this change did actually is create the potential for really serious misconduct to go unaddressed. And as you know, it does seem like a small change. It's just or to and it may seem like an esoteric concern, but it actually has really important practical consequences. So I'll try to succinctly explain. So the regulations define sexual harassment to include 3 categories of conduct. I would characterize the first as sexual violence. So it's sexual assault, relationship violence, and stalking. The second is quid pro quo sexual harassment, and the third is hostile environment sexual harassment. And it's that third one that we're concerned about in this conversation. So for probably 2 decades, the Office for Civil Rights defined hostile environment sexual harassment as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that's sufficiently severe, persistent, or pervasive that it limits a student's ability to benefit from their education. The regulations define it mostly pretty similarly, but there's that key difference. So instead of severe, persistent, or pervasive, they require conduct be both severe and pervasive. So that potentially excludes isolated incidents of verbal harassment and also some physical harassment, regardless of the severity. And I'll just give a couple examples to highlight that. So a single instance of a respondent making a complainant touch the respondent's genitals, that's one. A professor blocking a student's exit from the professor's office while uttering gender-based slurs. In my view, each of those is severe, especially when you account for factors like a power differential in the case of the professor. But they wouldn't be hostile environment sexual harassment under the regs because they only happen once, and they also don't fall under either of the other 2 definitions. So they're not sexual assault, for example. Now you see that conduct would still be addressed because we define sexual harassment more broadly, as I was sort of saying earlier. We define it more broadly than the regulations. But at schools that really strictly adopt the regulatory definition, complainants could be left without recourse. And as you indicated in your question, the department explained this change as necessary to avoid a chill on free speech and academic freedom. And it's really difficult for me to see how the conduct that I just gave as examples implicates either of those or otherwise what First Amendment interests this was really necessary to protect. So that's my humble and meek opinion on that.
Well, not meek, it's an expert opinion, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate the specific examples because I think that's really helpful. Danésha, Tommy, do either of you want to weigh in on this? No?
Yeah, I think I'll just add on to what Suzanne mentioned about how, at the UC system, we responded by, I kind of see this as 2 nested bowls, where even the bowl that of what falls under Title IX shrinks, we still have our internal, SVSH policy that captures everything that doesn't fall under Title IX. I think the biggest harm that this policy change has done is optically, because I think a lot of the students aren't aware of the nuances with the legal language and the procedures. Those aren't necessarily impacting students' day-to-day lives, but the message was very clear that was being sent to students is that it's going to be harder for you to make a report and it fall under Title IX. And that, I think, was just so harmful, because as much as we've done some wonderful work at the system level, at the campus level, ensuring students that we are updating the SVSH policy to ensure that everything that doesn't fall under Title IX will still be investigated and students can still receive support for that. That still wasn't the whole student body. So, but even if it just makes it more difficult for an already strained system to have to respond to something like this. And especially when students may not be the most trusting to campus resources and to campus systems, it just delivered a bit of a blow. So I think that's another important part of it, is that policy changes aren't just on paper. It extends far beyond the written word and how students perceive it and how students interpret it.
Oh, thank you. And I think everybody will be waiting with bated breath to see what happens in April. I'm not going to say I'll make you come back, and but at some point, maybe a year from now, we'll have to do a part 2, right, and see where we are. I have another question that actually, has to do, focuses really on people like you who are doing this work in the space. And that sometimes it's the people doing the good work that are the ones that receive kind of front end criticism from people on all sides of the political spectrum. And I'm wondering if you're able to share how potentially being named as part of the problem, especially as staff and advocates and as a graduate, how does that impact the work that you do? And Tommy, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with this. I don't think it's that being critical of the system and collaborating within the system are something that are mutually exclusive. I do think this kind of blanket statement of attacking or grouping the administrators as this negative blob can take away opportunities for collaboration, coalition building, even on issues that both administrators and students agree upon. And I think there's, especially when it comes to federal, state level advocacy, there's so many opportunities to build a diverse coalition, and diverse coalitions in general are just more powerful in pushing for change. So I think especially when it's something that we've been talking about is upcoming Title IX or upcoming Title IX changes that we're going to see. I think there's going to be a great opportunity for students administrators to build coalitions and push for that change, because we can just bring in different strengths that we have together. But yeah, I don't think it's the most productive to kind of chunk every person that's working on this policy space as part of the problem, because I just don't think that's productive. I think there's a lot more nuance when it goes into it, and that's what I would say.
Yeah, sometimes I don't think we have a lot of tolerance or patience for nuance in this moment. And so it's really important that you emphasize that. And it was actually it was intentional that we did this webinar before the regs came out, because I really, and Suzanne and I had talked about this, wanted this to be about more than the regs and the back and forth between administrations, and a more holistic look at the system and all the things that are happening. Danésha or Suzanne, anything on this kind of being potentially painted with the broad brush sometimes as people who are really in the trenches doing the work every day? No, if not, I got plenty.
No.
I
do.
You do? Okay.
I do. Yeah. I mean, it's challenging from a lot of different perspectives. One, and I think kind of piggybacking on what Tommy had said, that message, gets out and it impacts your fellow student body who could probably benefit from the resources and support available. And then if they're not feeling comfortable or confident to come forward, are they really getting the help that's there for them? And so that's always a concern. And I hope that many folks understand that most people that are drawn to this work feel very strongly about the work. We're very invested in supporting our community and our student body and doing the best work we possibly can. And so sometimes those broad brushes really kind of painting those who are in the trenches doing the work can impact those folks who are here and trying to really support our community, and we lose folks, right? And so people who are very talented, who are very committed and passionate and very knowledgeable, we don't want to lose those folks. We want to maintain them. We want to continue to have them around to do the good work. And so, it's that balance. Like, I agree that there should be appropriate critique, because a process moves forward and it evolves and it grows based on appropriate critique. But then there's that kind of that other edge to it where it's really painting the folks who do this work as somehow part of the problem that I feel is not as productive.
Okay, some more questions coming in the queue. One of them having to do with retaliation, and if someone could speak a little bit to what the policies are regarding retaliation after reporting, and I would even add, the fear of retaliation after reporting.
Well, I would just say that our policy, we at UC take retaliation very seriously. We have a strong prohibition against retaliation in our policy. it is treated on the same level as other types of prohibited conduct under the sexual harassment policy. We really encourage people who feel they've experienced retaliation to come forward. If they wanted an investigation and all of the facts were there, then the Title IX offices could actually conduct a formal investigation. It looks very much like a sexual harassment investigation to determine whether the policy was violated. And there are also things, as Danésha talked about earlier, that can be put in place that are protective of people who are fearful of retaliation, even without a formal complaint. So it's a really, if people are in fear of retaliation, they will come forward. So it's just critical that people know that we take that very seriously.
Okay, thank you. Tommy, Danésha, anything you want to add on that? Okay, otherwise we'll go to the next question, which is asking about the cases that no longer fall under the Title IX umbrella with the change in policy. The question is, are supportive services still being provided to those students that choose to disclose with no anonymity? For example, schedule changes, accommodations, the kinds of things that Tommy was talking about.
Well, I just want to say a little bit about how we're approaching those cases generally, kind of building on what Tommy said, and then maybe Danésha can talk about the services themselves. So at UC, again, we did not narrow the scope of our policies or the protections that we provide in response to the Title IX regulations. So we follow the regulations where we're required to do so by the regulations, and otherwise we follow our usual policies and procedures. And anyone who comes forward with concerns about sexual harassment is entitled to supportive measures. There hasn't been any change in that. And so maybe I'll let Danésha talk a little bit about the measures themselves.
Great. No, thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, we still provide the same supportive measures to any complainant. It's very much tailored to the need of the specific complainant themselves. It can include things such as no contact directives, housing changes, schedule changes, academic accommodations. It's really very much dependent on the needs of the individual survivor themselves. It's a conversation between those individuals and the Title IX office, and then other members on campus to effectuate those changes. And then we're continuing to check in with parties because changes need to change and things evolve over time. So we're always then also evaluating the efficacy of those supportive measures and whether things need to be updated. And then we'll continue those communications throughout the entire process to figure out what types of measures need to continue past past an adjudication process. So there's ongoing communication with parties to make sure that they're supported at the inception, in the middle, and after a resolution process is completed.
So there's still so many more questions coming in, which I think is wonderful. And for those questions that we aren't able to get to, we can make sure that somebody responds to you. I do want to circle back on our last couple of minutes to sort of the premise with which we started, which is about the power of student voices, and maybe give each of our panelists an opportunity to share some recommendations for how students can engage, especially for first-time activists who, and not just students, but I would say administrators or faculty, for someone who came to this conversation and feels like they'd like to do something. What would you recommend? And Tommy, let's start with you, and then go to Danésha, and then Suzanne.
Yeah, great. I'm actually going to hijack a bit of this question a little bit because for the interest of time, I hope that's okay. But I kind of want to make a call to action to the administrators and staff members that are in here in this panel with us, that I think there just needs to be more opportunities for student input to play a larger role in the policy process and developing programs and providing resources. In 2019, I wasn't even aware that there were spaces for students to be part of the decision-making process. And I think that's something that's a bit discouraging because a lot of students do care. If there's anything that we've seen based on the years of student activism regarding sexual violence is that students are willing to engage. So I would love to see these spaces created, but also there to be more intentional outreach from administrators to students to invite them in and ask them for feedback, because just creating a space isn't enough. I think there needs to be that two-way communication, that active relationship building. And the best way to start that is by inviting students in, not having students find out for themselves.
Thank you. I think that's a great call to action. And there are many staff and administrators, especially in the Title IX space, who have joined us today. So, Danésha.
So I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Tommy had just said. And then also I would encourage activists to get to know their campus, get to know what's available on their campus, resources, process, the folks who do the work, because a knowledgeable person is an empowered person. Once you have a better sense of what's available, what the process looks like, who are the people on your campus that you might be interacting with in terms of dealing with sexual harassment or sexual violence on campus, then that information can be shared. And the more people that have that information, the more empowered the community.
Great. Okay, Suzanne, what are some of your recommendations? And then we'll see if we can squeeze in one or two more questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to end on a point that may not be super popular, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. So I think that a person courageously sharing their own personal experience is really powerful. It's really brave and it's impactful for people who hear that story. In my view, the value of speech diminishes the further removed the speaker is from the personal experience. So for example, when in the really admirable spirit of solidarity and through the terrifying might of social media, multitudes add their voices to an individual who's telling their personal truth and call, for example, for a fellow student to be removed from the school, that I find that concerning. And I think, one of the concerns is that the distance or the remove that social media provides really allows us to ignore that the person on the other side of that is a human being. And that person might already be a marginalized student by virtue of their race or their gender identity or their disability status. They may themselves be a hurt human being. And that's not an excuse, but it is a reason for us to try to stretch our empathy in ways that aren't always comfortable. So I think it's really important to be clear that each of us as individuals and the university as an institution support people who come forward. And I'd like to see us as a culture really work to expand our kindness and our empathy in non-obvious ways as well. And I would love to see that in the student voices that are so powerful.
I'm not sure why that was unpopular, but I think it is an important note to end on. Obviously, you can't cover even a tiny bit of the thin layer of the deep issues, and I want to acknowledge a lot of questions, especially one about not just protecting potential survivors, but alleged perpetrators. And we will save this Q&A and see if we can get back to those folks. And I think the idea here today wasn't to answer all of the questions, but was to create a forum where people could ask some of those questions. And I think that what our panelists have shown us is that, like with all speech and engagement, education is the underpinning of it all. And that the more that we know, the better that we can respond and fight against things like sexual assault. And so with that, I just really want to thank Suzanne and Tommy and Danésha, who are busy doing incredible work on their campuses and in the UC system, but have taken a lot of time to not just be here today, but to prepare. And we will be sending out the recording and some resources that people can access. And I anticipate that our panelists will share their emails so that you can reach out to them, hopefully not just to learn more, but to become involved on your campus or the UC system generally. And with that, I think I will just say thank you. You can find out information about the center's opportunities for fellows and the Speech Matters Conference by clicking on this large QR code or going to our website. Our conference is coming up in April. That will be the next time that we will be doing some live programming, and it's going to be great. So in the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and thanks again to our panelists.